In the autumn of 1922, deep in the Mississippi Delta, where the soil was thick with memory and sorrow, Sarah Whitfield stood alone on the small stretch of land her husband had once tended with calloused, hopeful hands. The air carried a constant hush, as if the world itself feared to speak too loudly in a place where night riders still claimed the darkness as their own. Sarah, a young black widow with 2 children and no shield but her faith, lived in a house built from rough pine, boards, and unshakable resolve. Each sunrise found her bending over the earth Elijah left behind, and each sunset left her listening to the distant echo of hooves, the grim reminder that in Sunflower County, a woman standing alone was considered a challenge some men could not abide. The mornings on Sarah Whitfield's land began with a low mist rising from the cotton rows, soft as breath and cold as warning. She worked the soil with steady hands, her fingers numb from both the chill and the weight of her new life. Every movement carried the ghost of Elijah beside her, his laughter, his quiet strength, his stubborn belief that dignity could grow from the ground up. Now the fields felt different, almost watchful, as if the earth itself knew she was alone. Yet Sarah refused to bend. With each seed she pressed into the soil, she planted not just crops, but a quiet declaration: I am still here. But the Delta was not generous to women who carried their grief openly. At the general store, the white men leaned back in their chairs and watched her with the lazy interest of hunters observing a lone doe. They spoke softly when she approached, their voices thick with mockery disguised as courtesy. Some pretended to tip their hats, others simply stared, letting silence finish what their words dared not say. Still, Sarah kept her gaze steady, her chin lifted just enough to show she had not forgotten who she was or who her husband had been. At night, however, courage had a different sound. The house creaked under the pressure of memories and fear, and the wind scraped against the shutters like fingernails. Sarah sat by the dying embers of the hearth, Elijah's shotgun resting across her lap, its cold iron a comfort she never wanted but always needed. Ruth and Daniel slept close together on their small mattress, unaware of how many prayers their mother whispered over them before blowing out the lantern. In the stillness, she could almost hear the distant rumble of hooves, a reminder that danger traveled without haste, but never without purpose. The nights in Sunflower County carried a tension so thick it felt woven into the very air, pressing against the windows like an unseen hand. Sarah moved through her quiet home with deliberate care, each footstep measured, each breath held just long enough to listen beyond the walls. The memory of Elijah's warnings lingered in the corners, his voice low, steady, urging caution in a world that swallowed black men whole and expected their widows to follow. She checked the latch twice, then a third time, feeling the wood vibrate faintly beneath her fingertips, as though the house itself trembled with its own fearful knowing. Outside, the moon hung swollen and low, bathing the fields in a ghostly silver that made the cotton rows look like rows of gravestones. Inside, the small fire in the hearth crackled softly, its glow stretching across the floorboards and brushing the edges of her children's sleeping forms. Ruth clutched her doll beneath her chin, while Daniel's small hand curled into a determined fist, even in dreams, a quiet echo of the strength he had inherited from a father he barely remembered. Sarah watched them for a long moment, her heart caught between tenderness and dread, knowing she must forever stand between them and a world eager to swallow their light. She lowered herself beside the hearth, resting the shotgun across her lap once more, the weight of it grounding her as surely as any scripture. The night hummed with possibility, good or evil, she could not yet tell. Then came the sound that broke the fragile peace, the slow crunch of tires rolling over gravel, far too deliberate to be accidental. Sarah's pulse quickened, every nerve within her tightening like a drawn thread. The darkness beyond the window shifted as a pair of headlights cut across the yard, their beams dragging long, hungry shadows across the floor. She felt the air thicken, felt the past rise up inside her like smoke, choking the throat. For a breathless second, she prayed the car would pass, prayed it would turn toward the river road or the churchyard path. But the engine slowed, then stilled, settling into a silence more terrifying than its approach. Sarah stood, the weight of the shotgun familiar in her hands, and whispered to the children, soft, urgent, sacred, "Stay asleep, my babies. Stay safe." The silence outside deepened until it felt like a living thing, thick, expectant, breathing against the fragile walls of the cabin. Sarah crept toward the window, each step a tremor of will against the instinct to hide. She parted the curtain with 2 fingers, just enough to see the black Model T idling beyond the fence line, its engine dead, but its threat alive and pulsing. 3 silhouettes sat inside, rigid as carved stone, their faces swallowed by shadow. They did not knock. They did not call out her name. They simply waited, the way predators wait when they are certain the prey has nowhere left to run. The moonlight caught the outline of one man's hat, then the faint red spark of a cigarette as he lit it, briefly illuminating a pale, cruel mouth she recognized from the general store, the same man who'd once warned her that the Delta had no mercy for widows who stood too tall. A low murmur rose from the car, followed by laughter, quiet, mean, carrying the ease of men who believed fate itself bent to their will. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, that shift from fear into something harder, sharper, forged by years of loss and long nights awake. She turned toward Ruth and Daniel, asleep on their mattress of patched quilts, their bodies curled in trust that she must never betray. Kneeling, she brushed a hand across their hair, absorbing the warmth of their breath, the fragile innocence they still carried. Then she leaned close to their ears and whispered the words she had practiced only in her darkest thoughts. "If I say run, you run to the trees. Don't look back." It was a command born not of panic, but of a mother's final vow. Rising again, Sarah slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, feeling the vibration of her own heartbeat echo through the frame. She took her place at the center of the room, the shotgun balanced in her hands like the weight of a decision she had already made. Outside, the cigarette ember flickered. Again, as the man stepped from the car, boots crunching against the gravel with slow, deliberate menace. He called something over his shoulder, too quiet to catch, then laughed, a sound stripped of humanity. This was no warning visit. This was an ending they had come to deliver. But inside that small house, with the fire's faint glow painting her silhouette in gold, Sarah Whitfield felt a resolve settle over her like armor. If they planned to claim this night, they would discover what a mother becomes when her children are threatened. Tonight, the darkness would not swallow her. Tonight she would stand. The first knock came soft, so soft it almost felt like a mockery of gentleness, a predator tapping politely before baring its teeth. Sarah froze, breath caught halfway to her lungs, listening to the wood tremble beneath the man's knuckles. The second knock cracked harder, rattling the thin door and sending dust drifting from the rafters. "Evening, Miss Whitfield," a voice drawled, smooth and venomous, the false civility of a man who believed kindness was something he could weaponize. She recognized it instantly. Harlan Brewer, Elijah's former boss, the man whose warnings had slithered beneath every rumor about her husband's death. Now he stood inches away, disguised in the night, pretending he had come for conversation instead of blood. "No need for a door between us," he coaxed. "Open up, and we can come to an understanding." But the understanding was already clear. He hadn't come to speak. He had come to finish the message Elijah died carrying. Behind her, Ruth whispered, "Mama, who is it?" Her voice quivered like the flame in the hearth. Sarah motioned for silence, her finger pressed to her lips as her heart beat loud enough to drown out thought. Then came a third blow, not a knock, but a violent kick that bowed the wood inward and made the hinges scream. Harlan's honeyed tone vanished, replaced by something jagged and unmasked. "We know you're in there, woman. Don't make us come through it." Bootsteps circled the porch. Shadows crawled across the curtains like claws searching for weak points. Then the smell hit, sharp, oily, unmistakable. Kerosene seeped beneath the door, burning Sarah's throat with its bitter fumes. They had brought fire. They intended to erase her, her children, her home, and the memory of her defiance in one merciless sweep. For a breath, terror pressed against her ribs, but beneath it something fiercer stirred, an ancient, relentless fire passed down through generations of mothers who had held back the dark with nothing but their bodies and their prayers. She moved quickly, guiding her children to the kitchen rug with a steadiness she did not feel. Lifting the edge, she revealed the small trap-door Elijah had built years before, a hidden space carved out of fear and foresight. "Down you go," she whispered, her voice trembling only once. Ruth hesitated, tears pooling in her eyes. Daniel clutched her skirt with both hands. "Mama, now!" Sarah commanded, pushing them gently into the hollow darkness. She pulled the rug back into place, sealing their small gasps beneath the floorboards, just as another savage kick shattered part of the doorframe. The men outside laughed, cruel and triumphant, their boots scraping against the porch as they readied themselves for the final strike. Sarah stepped back, raised the shotgun, and felt the weight of every moment that had led to this one settle into her bones. If they wanted to bring fire to her doorstep, then she would answer with thunder. The first torch hit the porch with a hollow thud that shook the house to its foundation, and instantly the night exploded into orange fury. Flames licked upward, hungry and wild, casting monstrous shapes across the thin wooden walls. Smoke seeped through the cracks like a living thing, curling around Sarah's legs as she crouched behind the kitchen table with the shotgun braced against her shoulder. The torchlight painted her face in flickering gold, her breath steady despite the chaos unraveling inches away. Outside, the men shouted over the roar of the fire, orders, curses, giddy anticipation. Their boots hammered the porch boards, each step a countdown to destruction. Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the gun so tightly her knuckles went pale. She knew what came next. She had seen it done to others. Burn them out, then drag them out. But tonight the flames would not be the only force waiting at the threshold. The door shuddered, then burst inward in a storm of splinters as the first hooded figure charged through, torch raised like some unholy crown. Instinct surged through Sarah, sharp, primal, absolute. She squeezed the trigger. The deafening blast filled the small house, echoing off the walls like thunder rolling across a battlefield. The man fell instantly, his torch skittering across the floor and igniting the curtains in a violent burst of flame. Smoke billowed upward, thick and choking, turning the room into a swirling haze of heat and shadows. Outside, the others stumbled back in shock, their voices ragged with fear. "She shot him! Lord, she shot him!" The panic in their tone was unmistakable. Predators rarely expected their prey to fight back. Sarah reloaded, coughing as the smoke clawed at her throat, her eyes burning but unbroken. This was no longer survival. It was defiance. Another figure moved outside the window, a blur swallowed by smoke and fire. Sarah steadied herself, aimed through the haze, and fired again. A scream tore through the night, sharp and piercing, then vanished beneath the crackle of flames. For a heartbeat, the world went still, the air vibrating with the weight of what she had done. A black woman in Mississippi had struck down the men who claimed dominion over fear itself. But the house was no longer her ally. The fire, Elijah, once built for warmth, had become a living enemy, devouring walls and beams with unstoppable hunger. Smoke poured from every corner, filling her lungs, dimming her vision. She staggered, clutching the shotgun, the heat pressing against her skin like molten hands. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, her children trembled in the dark, waiting for her signal. Sarah knew she had little time left, not to fight, but to save what mattered most. She whispered a prayer through the smoke, then ran toward the trapdoor, ready to pull her babies into the burning world and lead them toward whatever light remained. The heat inside the collapsing house surged like a living beast, clawing at Sarah's skin as she fought her way back across the burning floorboards. Flames snapped at the walls Elijah had built with his own hands, boards splitting apart in sharp cracks that echoed like gunfire. Smoke rolled through the room in thick waves, burning her throat with every breath. She dropped to her knees at the rug covering the trapdoor and yanked it aside, releasing a rush of hot, suffocating air into the narrow space below. "Babies, come on!" she coughed, her voice barely more than a rasp. For a terrifying second there was no sound, only the roar of the fire and her own pounding pulse, until a small, soot-streaked hand reached up from the darkness. Daniel emerged first, eyes wide with terror, followed by Ruth, who clung to him with trembling fingers. Sarah wrapped them, both in her arms, pulling them into the burning room as gently as she could, while the ceiling groaned above them like a dying creature. She shielded their faces with her body as she guided them toward the back door, dodging falling beams and clouds of red-hot embers. Every step forward felt like dragging her children through the mouth of an inferno, each breath a battle. When they finally burst into the yard, the cool night air hit them in a wrenching wave. Ash floated around them like dark snow, drifting in the faint glow of the burning house. Sarah pushed the children toward the old pecan tree at the fence line, her hands trembling, her lungs desperate for clean air. "Stay here," she told them, knees hitting the dirt as she knelt before them. "Don't move till I come back." Daniel grabbed her arm, eyes shining with terror. "Mama, don't go!" She held his small hand, pressing it to her cheek. "I have to," she whispered. "Just a moment." Because inside that burning house, inside the flames that sought to erase everything she loved, was Elijah's Bible, the one book that had held their family upright when the world tried to break them. Without hesitating, Sarah ran back toward the doorway, the heat slamming into her like a wall. Sparks rained down as the roof buckled, the boards above her splitting with a sound like thunder. She pushed through the smoke, staggering toward the table where the Bible lay, its leather edges already curling from the fire's relentless hunger. She snatched it up, pressing it to her chest as a beam behind her crashed to the floor in a spray of embers. The world swayed around her. Smoke, heat, the suffocating roar of the burning home, but she forced herself forward, stumbling through the doorway and into the open air. She collapsed to her knees beside her children, dragging in a desperate breath as the house behind them let out a final groan and fell inward, sending sparks shooting up into the night sky. Sarah held the Bible close, its cover singed, but its pages untouched, and whispered through trembling lips, "You see, the fire can't take what God gave us." By dawn, the night's violence had settled into a haunting stillness, the sky washed in pale grey, as if the morning itself mourned what had been taken. The small cabin, once a refuge held together by Elijah's hands and Sarah's hope, now lay in a smouldering heap, its timbers reduced to blackened ribs jutting through drifting smoke. The earth still hissed where embers met the dew, releasing thin curls of steam that twisted upward like the last breath of a dying thing. Sarah sat beneath the old pecan tree with Ruth and Daniel nestled against her sides, their faces streaked with soot and dried tears, but their small chests rising and falling with the soft rhythm of sleep. Her own body ached, her burned hands, her raw throat, her trembling muscles, but beneath the exhaustion lay something steadier than pain, the pure, unbroken certainty that they had survived. And survival in Sunflower County was its own kind of rebellion. As the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the fields gold, Sarah wiped a trembling hand across Ruth's forehead and felt a swell of gratitude so fierce it nearly brought her to her knees. She had saved them. God had saved them. Together they had walked through fire and come out breathing on the other side. For a moment, she allowed herself the quiet mercy of stillness, letting the morning light warm her face as she watched smoke lift gently into the air like a prayer rising from the ruins. But peace lasted only until she heard footsteps on the dirt road, slow, weighted, familiar. Every muscle in her body tightened, instinct urging her to rise, to shield the children again. Yet when she turned, it was not a rider, not a threat. It was Martha Lewis, her closest neighbor, carrying a bucket of water in both hands and grief carved deep into her weathered face. Martha dropped to her knees beside Sarah, the bucket tilting and spilling water into the dust. Tears filled the older woman's eyes as she took Sarah's blistered hands into her own, the gesture gentle enough to undo every guard Sarah had held since the fire began. "Oh, Sarah, Lord have mercy, child," she whispered. "They did this?" The words trembled with horror, though they both knew the answer. Sarah nodded, jaw tightening as her gaze drifted back to the smoking ruins. "They came for me, Martha, but they didn't take us." Martha's breath hitched as she looked toward the sleeping children, their small bodies curled against their mother like seedlings, seeking the last warmth of the earth. "You shot back, didn't you?" she asked softly, reverently. Sarah lifted her eyes, steady and unashamed. I did what I had to. The truth hung between them, dangerous, holy, unshakable. And Martha, with tears slipping down her cheeks, squeezed Sarah's hand and whispered, "You ain't alone, child. Not no more." By midday, the yard had begun to fill, not with flames or riders, but with the quiet, resolute footsteps of those who had heard the echoes of the night and refused to let Sarah face the morning alone. Men arrived first, shoulders hunched and eyes hard, carrying hammers, nails, and lengths of salvaged lumber. Women followed with blankets, bread, jars of water, and the soft murmur of prayers spoken under their breath. No one asked for details. No one blinched at the scorched earth or the lingering scent of kerosene. They simply stepped into the ruins and began the solemn work of lifting what the darkness had tried to bury. Sarah watched as Martha guided the women toward the children, wrapping quilts around their shoulders, while the men sifted through the wreckage, pulling away charred boards one by one. It was as if the entire community had decided, in a single, unspoken breath, that what had happened to Sarah's home belonged to all of them. Word spread faster than the smoke had risen. By the second day, whispers moved through the county like wind through cotton. The widow fought them. The widow stood her ground. In the general store, the post office, along the dirt roads that braided the delta together, people repeated the same astonished phrase. She shot the clan. Some said she killed 2 men. Others swore there were 3 bodies dragged away before dawn. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was this: someone who was supposed to be afraid had not been afraid. Someone who was supposed to kneel remained standing. In a place where silence had been survival, Sarah's defiance became a spark rolling through dry timber. Hope for some, humiliation for others. And humiliation in Sunflower County was a wound white men did not easily forgive. The sheriff arrived that afternoon, riding up the dirt road with 2 deputies close behind him, dust rising around their horses like ghosts of authority trying to reclaim ground they had abandoned. He dismounted slowly, his sunburned face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Sarah stood at the edge of the ruins with Martha and several neighbors gathered behind her, a wall of quiet strength. The sheriff kicked at a piece of charred wood, then looked up at her with a cold, narrowed gaze. "There's talk," he drawled. "Serious talk. Folks say you shot 2 white men last night." Sarah didn't move. Her burned hands hung at her sides, her children pressed close to her dress. "Men came to my door," she answered. "They brought fire and death with them. I sent it back." The sheriff's jaw tightened, his pride wounded by the calm in her voice. "You best watch yourself, woman," he hissed. "It ain't the law's job to protect folks who think they're above it." Sarah stepped forward, her voice low and unflinching. "And who protects us when the law wears the same boots as the men who burn our homes?" Silence fell, sharp, electrifying. When the sheriff finally turned his horse and rode away, it was not victory Sarah felt, but something deeper, the unmistakable beginning of a fight she had not asked for, but would finish. As the days stretched on, the nights grew heavier once more, settling over Sunflower County with a weight that felt almost biblical. Sarah tucked Ruth and Daniel into the narrow bed of the small shack Martha had opened to them, smoothing their hair as though the gentleness of her touch could erase the memory of flame. When they slept, she took her place by the window with Elijah's shotgun laid across her knees, its metal cool against her blistered palms. Every distant dog bark, every snapping twig in the yard made her pulse quicken. Fear no longer roared. It whispered, coiling quietly in the corners like a serpent waiting for her courage to fade. But instead of fading, her courage settled deeper, anchoring itself like a stone sinking to the river floor. In the hush of the midnight hours, she looked out upon the road where death had once parked beneath the harvest moon and felt not dread, but a steady, stubborn vigilance. Rumors drifted through the delta like drifting ash. The clan had met 3 nights in a row, their anger simmering hotter with each gathering. Their dead now had names, sons of merchants, nephews of aldermen, and with those names came a thirst for vengeance. A deacon from a neighboring church rode out to warn Sarah in a whisper. His had clutched tight against the wind. "They say they come in again," he murmured. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon." Sarah listened in silence, the warning settling into her bones like cold water. She didn't argue, didn't tremble, didn't ask for mercy. "Let them come," she finally said. "I've got nothing left they can burn that matters." Her words held no bravado, only the unvarnished truth of a woman who had already walked through fire and found the flames survivable. Still, she prepared. She taught Ruth how to slip quietly through the trees, following the river's bend to safety. She showed Daniel where the shells were kept and how to hide Elijah's Bible beneath his shirt should they ever need to flee again. It was not the childhood she wanted for them, but it was the one the world forced upon them. Meanwhile, their neighbors, once cautious, once fearful, began to appear daily with lumber, nails, and quiet determination. Together they raised a new cabin on the ashes of the old, each plank hammered into place with a kind of solemn, sacred promise. This house was smaller, built of thick pine boards and iron nails, sturdy enough to stand even when hatred blew hard against it. "They want to see fear when they look this way," Martha said, wiping sweat from her brow as she handed Sarah a beam. "Let them see us build instead." And build they did, their labor echoing across the fields like a hymn of refusal. But deep in the marrow of every worker, every mother, every child who carried water to the builders lived the quiet awareness that the clan had not retreated, they had recoiled. And recoiling things, sooner or later, strike. That night, as Sarah sat on the porch of her newly risen cabin with her children sleeping beside her, she looked out toward the winding dirt road and whispered into the dark, "You know where I live. Come see what God left standing." The wind carried her words into the fields, and though she could not see it, something out there stirred. It was close to midnight when the first sound broke the stillness. Soft at first, almost disguised by the whisper of wind through the pines, but Sarah heard it. Hooves, slow, deliberate, unforgiving. She rose from the porch before the echo fully reached her door, her hand already closing around Elijah's shotgun. Inside, Ruth and Daniel slept on the floor beside her, wrapped in the quilt Martha had stitched from scraps of burnt fabric, a reminder of what had been lost and what refused to die. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and distant river water. Fog drifted low across the field, curling like smoke from an invisible fire. Then came the second sound, the low rumble of men's voices, riding the wind in jagged murmurs, too far to hear the words, close enough to feel the hatred shaping them. Sarah moved to the window with the quiet precision of someone who had practiced this moment in the theater of her mind. And there they were, 6 riders emerging from the mist, their robes ghosting across the fog like the pale shadows of a nightmare she recognized all too well. They came without torches this time, no flickering flames to announce their approach. They had learned from the first night, darkness was their ally now, and death their silent companion. But the absence of fire did not conceal the glint of metal beneath their coats, the rifles strapped to their saddles, the yashoyo pistols at their hips. Sarah inhaled slowly, her breath a thin thread of resolve. For days she had prepared for this night. Behind the cabin, she had dug a trench and camouflaged it with brush, laying a clean line of lantern oil that curved toward the gate like a waiting serpent. If they wanted to bring the night to her door again, she would show them what lived on the other side of fear. The riders halted at her gate, the horses stamping impatiently in the soft dirt. One dismounted, a tall man with broad shoulders and a voice roughened by age and cruelty. Not Harlan Brewer this time, but someone who had studied cruelty long enough to wear it without effort. "Sarah Whitfield," he bellowed, "you've made your point. Now come out and pay the price." The others shifted in their saddles, their white hoods turning toward the cabin like a field of poisoned flowers. Sarah glanced down at her sleeping children, their unknowing faces so still in the dim light that her heart clenched. She whispered a prayer, wordless, raw, an offering from a mother who had nothing left but faith and fire. Then she rose. "Lord," she murmured as she lifted the oil lantern, "if you can't stop them, then guide my hands." She hurled the lantern through the window, and the night erupted into blazing light as the oil caught the grass in a sudden roar of flames. Horses reared, men cursed, and Sarah stepped into the doorway with the shotgun raised high, firelight painting her face. In bronze and fury, the fire leapt across the yard in a sudden ferocious sweep, turning the damp grass into a wall of living flame. The riders reeled back in panic, their horses screaming as shadows and heat collided in a chaotic burst. Sarah didn't wait for them to regain their footing. She lifted Elijah's shotgun, braced her feet in the doorway, and fired into the blaze, once, twice, each blast cracking through the night like thunder tearing open the heavens. One man fell hard, his white robe igniting as he hit the ground. The others scattered, stumbling over one another as the fire's glow warped their shapes into frantic, fleeing silhouettes. Smoke curled through the mist, turning the world into a fevered swirl of orange and grey. Behind Sarah, Ruth and Daniel stirred, blinking awake to the terrifying beauty of flames dancing outside their home. But this time, fear did not hollow their mother's face. Power did. A quiet, unyielding power forged in fire and grief. The man who had spoken, who had ordered her to pay for her defiance, scrambled to mount his horse again, but the animal thrashed wildly, spooked by the sudden inferno rising between them. "Fall back!" he shouted, voice cracking under the weight of dread. The riders pulled away, tripping over the burning trench as the flames raced along the oil-soaked path Sarah had laid days before. Fire roared behind them like a pursuing army, illuminating the trees in violent flashes. Sarah stepped further into the doorway, her silhouette framed in gold, the shotgun steady in her hands. "You came for a woman," she called over the roar of the flames, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "But you met a mother." Her words struck harder than any bullet. The men who had arrived certain of victory now fled as prey, their retreat swallowed by fire and fog. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt what it was to make terror tremble. When the last hoofbeat disappeared into the trees, a great and sudden stillness fell over the yard. The flames sputtered into low, hissing embers, licking at the charred earth where men had once stood certain of their power. Sarah lowered the shotgun slowly, her arms trembling from recoil and exhaustion. The mist returned, drifting through the smoke like a gentle shroud, softening the edges of destruction. Daniel appeared in the doorway, barefoot and frightened, clutching the bag of shotgun shells to his chest as if holding the beating heart of their survival. "Mama," he whispered. "They gone?" Sarah knelt and gathered both children into her arms, pressing their foreheads to her shoulders. "They're gone, baby," she murmured, her voice ragged but sure. "Gone tonight and tomorrow." She looked out toward the dark fields where the firelight was fading, her eyes reflecting a hard-won truth. "Tomorrow, the world will know we did not bow." By sunrise, the story had already begun to move, slipping through the delta on whispered breaths, stirring the dust along the roads, traveling farther and faster than any rider who had fled from her flames. Neighbors came first, drawn by